All right, welcome to episode 7. Nope, it's not episode 7, it's episode 8. Welcome to episode 8 of season 3 of Read by the Author. Tonight we are continuing Time Anomaly, and we will be starting part 3 of the book, which dives into a new perspective. And I'm really excited about starting this part because the perspective is Kat. Kat is a character that we met in Echo and Time briefly. She is Lex's half-sister, and she is one of probably my all-time favorite character that I have ever created. And obviously I loved her so much because I ended up giving her her own series when I finished the ECHO TRILOGY. So let's dive into part 3 of Time Anomaly. Part 3. Cairo, Egypt, present day. 18. Kat and Jenny. Dear Lex, it's Kat, BT dubs. You've been gone for hours and Marcus is seriously starting to lose it, just so you know. He destroyed your suite. Like, complete and utter destruction. If that's what true love looks like, I'm definitely not ready for anything close to that. But anyway, Dom said he saw you in the OT and he thought you were trying to tell him that you're in another time. I'm writing this to you on the chance that you time jumped into the future. If you're reading this, please just come back. Neffy's been monitoring Marcus, and she said his withdrawals have already started. She and Dom were talking super quietly, but I think they forgot that my Nigerette traits are starting to kick in, and, that I could, hear a little better. Anyway, I overheard them saying that they didn't think he'd last much longer than a week without you, which means you won't last longer than a week without him. You have to come back. We're all so worried about you. Please, just come back. Your half-sis, Kat. Kat! Jenny called from the bathroom. Do you want me to leave the straightener on? Jenny wasn't really my sister, but she was sort of like my sister since she was Lex's half-sister and Lex was my half-sister. Whatever. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that Jenny was as freaked out about Lex's disappearance as I was. And in my book, which is the book, that made us family. Abandoning my notebook and pen, I rolled off the ginormous bed and headed toward the bathroom door. Nope, not like it'll do any good in this heat. The straightening iron hadn't tamed my dark, frizzy curls in Florence, and I doubted it would do any better in Cairo. Jenny and I had been sharing a room since the set incident, as we've been calling what happened in the underground temple. I'd tried staying with my mom at first, but she was still pissed at me about risking my life. I roll for Lex. So I'd asked Jenny if I could stay with her for a while. It is weird that Mom didn't even argue, though. I leaned my shoulder against the door frame and watched Jenny stare at herself in the mirror, her mouth open as she put on mascara. Are you sure that's such a good idea? I asked. We'd both been a blink away from crying like 2-year-olds since Dom told us about Lex's disappearance. Jenny offered me a watery smile in the mirror. It's a deterrent. If I know my mascara will smear, I won't cry. She crossed her fingers. I'm hoping. I looked at my naked wrist. Jay, it's like 4 a.m, and we're all gonna look like crap from being up all night anyway. Why even try? Jenny lowered her mascara wand and sighed. Grandma Sue's, that's Alexander's wife, she always says that the best way to get through the worst times is to do normal things, like go to work, clean, get ready. Jenny shrugged and looked away, but I could see her chin trembling in the mirror. She cleared her throat. So that's what I'm doing, she said as she returned her attention to her reflection and raised the mascara wand to her other eye. Normal things. Pushing off the doorframe, I stepped into the bathroom to stand beside her. I reached for the straightening iron and moved it closer to me before finger combing through my long, frizzy curls and picking out a section to start with. I raised the straightener to my hair. Normal things. My eyes flicked down to the reflection of Jenny's belly. She was just starting to show under her sweater. Is that how you've been dealing with, With another sigh, Jenny jabbed the mascara wand into the tube and turned to face me, resting her hip on the edge of the pale granite counter. At first, yeah, but not anymore. Looking down, she touched her barely there baby bump. It's not the baby's fault, and I'm going to love him or her no matter how psychotic their dad is. Because, Lex and Dom, you're all Seth's kids too, and there's nothing wrong with you guys. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and ran the hot iron down the length of my hair. Every day I saw more and more of my dad in my face, like his sharp features were taking over, or maybe it was just an illusion caused by my paling skin. So annoying. I'd worked really hard to build up a tan this summer, and now my Negerette regenerative abilities were wiping it away like it had never existed. I glared at my reflection. I hate you, Set. And I couldn't help but wonder if maybe Jenny was wrong. What if Set's evilness would somehow spill over into their kid? What if it had spilled over into me? Did you ever consider, not, having the baby? I asked her. Jenny laughed softly. You can say abortion. I won't freak out. She touched my shoulder and headed out of the bathroom. But no, I didn't. I guess it's just not something I could bring myself to do. I could hear her rummaging around in the wardrobe. Lex would, I think. She never really wanted kids anyway. She's always had a one-track mind, and up until she met Marcus, that single track was all about Egypt, which could be so annoying, let me tell you. She was quiet for a moment, and there was the sound of more rummaging. Ah, there you are. But maybe now that Marcus is in her life, she'll change her mind about starting a family? She doesn't know. She can't, I said softly. Jenny appeared in the doorway, slipping on some sky blue ballet flats. What was that? I swallowed and met her eyes in the mirror. Lex can't have kids. Why? Because of her position as the mess sweat or whatever? I shook my head and refocused on my own reflection, moving on to a new section of hair. Negerettes can't have kids once they manifest. It's impossible. Jenny's eyes went wide and she brought her hand up to her mouth. Oh, I didn't know. She frowned and looked down at the floor. I'm sorry. That must be so awful. I can't imagine. I shrugged. I've known for pretty much ever, so it's no biggie for me. It's normal, just the way it is, But for someone like Lex, who wasn't raised knowing what she might be, yeah, finding it out would suck balls. I rolled my eyes and exhaled heavily. I bet that was a fun conversation for Alexander. Jenny continued to stare at the floor, but she brought her arms up to her belly and wrapped them around her middle. Her shoulders were shaking. I set down the straightener and turned to her. Hey, Jay. I rubbed my hands up and down her arms, crouching down a little so I could see her face. It's cool, really. I'm fine with it. Jenny shook her head. Dark smears of mascara bled from her lower lashes. I'm just so scared for Lex. I just got her back, and now... A hiccuping sob cut her words short, and her shoulders shook even harder. Now, I don't know if I'll ever see her again. I wrapped my arms around Jenny and held her tightly while she cried, finding tears of my own. Some people sympathy vomit or sympathy yawn, but I had always been a horrible sympathy crier. Of course, the fact that I was afraid of the same damn thing didn't help one damn bit. The tears broke free. Damn. Someone started knocking on the suite door. Knocking and knocking and knocking. Growling under my breath, I released Jenny and stomped to the door. What? I said as I yanked it open. Dominic was standing in the hallway with his fist still raised. I studied him with scrutinizing eyes. For once, his prim and proper shell seemed to be cracked. His normally slicked-back hair hung in dark ribbons around his face. His eyes were shadowed, and his shirt was untucked, the top few buttons undone. You look like crap, I told him, gaining at least a teensy bit of pleasure from seeing him so out of sorts. He was my usual instructor in how to use my new superpowers, and sometimes he could be such a... Nephi has need of you and Jenny in the lab, he said, rubbing his face with his knocking hand before lowering it down to his side. His accent was heavier, which meant he was really freaking exhausted. The lab? What lab? I cocked my head to the side. There's a lab? It is underground, in the sub-basement too. I held up my hand. Hold on a sec here, buddy. This place has an underground? What does she need? Jenny asked from behind me. I glanced over my shoulder to find that she had wiped the dark smudges from under her red-rimmed eyes. She thinks she may have come up with a way to decrease the severity of Marcus's withdrawal symptoms, but she needs both of you in order to test her theory. I huffed out a breath. Geesh, Dom, why didn't you just say so in the first place? I pushed past him through the doorway and headed down the hall toward the nearest set of stairs. I did. Are there going to be needles involved? I asked Nephi as I sat on a metal stool beside Jenny. We were in the lab in sub-basement 2, having taken somewhat hidden elevators from the ground floor, where the above-ground parts of the council's Cairo palace were very antique-y and low-tech. The underground was about as ultra-modern and high-tech as I could imagine. Everything was stainless steel or polished white or pristine glass, and with the lack of windows, I felt like I was on some sort of futuristic spaceship. When Nephi didn't respond, I added, "'Cause I am not a big fan of needles." Nephi paused in prepping her microscope slide and met my eyes, looking bored. She took a deep breath, exhaling heavily, then returned her attention to her equipment. Okay, never mind. I didn't want an answer anyway, I muttered. Nephi stilled, closing her eyes for a moment. You are a saint, she said, glancing at Dominic, who was standing opposite her at a high stainless steel table. Jenny coughed, and I was pretty sure she was masking a laugh. I glared at each of them in turn. Finally, Nephi gave Jenny and me her full attention. Are you sweating? My eyebrows knitted together. No. Why? I looked at Jenny, who shook her head. Nephi waved her hand at the open floor space in front of our stools. Do some jumping jacks. Jenny and I exchanged a look as we stood and moved a couple steps away from each other. Half-heartedly, I started hopping and flailing my arms, looking anywhere but at Dominic. I hated that he was watching me look so stupid. How long? Feet together. Do we have to? Feet apart. Do this, I asked. Feet together, feet apart, feet together. Nephi offered me a tight smile. Until you sweat. I bared my gritted teeth to her. Great. She looked at Dominic. Will you please hunt down my father? I will need him to be present to test the effectiveness of the synthesized pheromone cocktail. Standing, Dominic nodded. I will send someone right down. He started toward the door. Thank you, Dom, Nephi said. She glanced at me. And please, hurry. 5 minutes later, I was most definitely starting to sweat. I stopped doing jumping jacks and plopped down on my stool. Jenny did the same. Nephi planted herself in front of us. Are you sweating? Jenny and I both nodded. Good. Take off your shirts. We stared at her for a few seconds. Jenny said in chorus with my indignant, What? Exhaling heavily through her nose, Nephi pressed her lips together. I need to access the sweat on the skin under your underarms. It is the easiest way for me to gather a sample of the various pheromones given off by your bodies. She held up a long cotton swab and tilted her head to the side. I'm trying to save my father's and your sister's lives, so your unhindered cooperation would be appreciated. With another exchanged look, Jenny and I pulled our shirts over our heads. Luckily, Nephi had her samples, and we were back to being fully clothed by the time Marcus pushed the lab door open, because him walking in when we were topless would have been mortifying.
I still think this is a waste of time, Neffy,
Marcus said as he strode over to Neffy's workspace and eased down on a stool. He looked awful, or as awful as he could ever look. I sighed and rethought what I had written to Lex. True love, at least with someone who looked like him, might just be worth all the trouble. We sat and watched Neffy work for what felt like hours. I tried to make small talk with Jenny, but she looked almost as haggard as Marcus, and I didn't feel far behind. Neffy was the only one of us who didn't seem to be wilting under the weight of exhaustion and dark emotions. No, Neffy was handling the situation in an entirely different way. She was focusing on a problem she could solve. Maybe. The door opened, making all of us jump. But only Jenny, Neffy, and I actually looked up. Marcus simply stared at the metal tabletop like he wasn't even there, which I realized might actually have been the case. Nothing was stopping him from spending his time searching the unstable Aught for Lex. Dominic came into the lab ahead of a petite negerette with a dark bob, bronze skin, and pixie-like features.
Marcus, I'm sorry, Dominic said. She demanded to see you right away.
He stopped several paces away from Marcus, holding out his arm to block the woman from reaching him.
She claims to know you, and to know how to help you.
When Marcus still didn't turn around, Dominic glanced at Neffy, who frowned and shook her head. It looked like she didn't know the strange negerette either.
Heru,
the woman said.
Please.
Marcus lifted his head and, ever so slowly, turned around on his stool.
Aset?
19. Friend and Foe. Marcus stood and approached the negerette like he was moving through tar. When he reached her, he raised his hand and touched the side of her face.
You're real, he whispered. Aset, how are you real? You died. I saw.
But you didn't see, did you, brother? The woman, Aset, said with a hollow laugh. Set blinded you, and you only thought I had been killed. You all thought I'd been killed, because you had to think that.
But
you never saw my body, dear brother. She covered his hand with her own, leaning her cheek against his palm and closing her eyes. Feel me, Heru. I am real. She opened her eyes and smiled up at him. I'm real. A choking sob escaped from Marcus, and he moved so quickly, raising his other hand and lowering his face to Aset's, that it took me several seconds to register what he was doing. He was kissing her. My eyes bulged. It was nothing crazy, and there was clearly no tongue or anything like that, but still, he was kissing someone who was definitely not Lex. Hey! Jenny stood and took a few steps toward them, but Neffy caught hold of her wrist before Jenny could get past her.
Don't,
Neffy hissed. Jenny threw her free hand out toward Marcus and Aset in an almost violent gesture, just as the pair broke apart. But
she's his sister. His twin sister, she said. It's nothing like what you're thinking.
There was only one thing that I was thinking. Ew. Aset took a step back from Marcus and looked past him, her eyes settling first on Jenny, then on me.
I have nothing but the utmost respect for your sister. I would never do anything to hurt her. And my love for Heru is purely that of a sister.
I remained on my stool, bug-eyed, as I watched the scene before me.
Lex, you know Lex, Marcus said. How? Do you know where she is?
Aset nodded, her lips curving into a sad smile.
I do, dear brother. I know where she is. And when?
A collective, heavy exhale filled the room.
So you were right, Marcus said to Dom, who only nodded and continued to stare at Marcus's no longer deceased sister.
Yes, he was right. Lex is safe, blah, blah, blah. Aset shifted her canvas shoulder bag and started digging through it. A moment later, she pulled out a small, carved wooden box. She handed it to Marcus.
For you, from Lex. She gave this to you?
He accepted the tiny container, but hardly looked at it.
So you've seen her since the incident last night?
Aset smiled. Who do you think drove the getaway car? My mouth fell open. Heru's sister kidnapped Lex? I stared at Dom and Marcus, not understanding why they weren't hauling her away to interrogate her.
Long story short.
I want the long story, Marcus said.
Aset pursed her lips. And I'll give you the long story once we're on our way.
Where are we?
She raised one hand in a sharp motion, cutting him off. Lex is with Nguyen, and with you and me, in Mennefer, a month or two before Nguyen's death. I don't remember how many days exactly.
She traveled back over 4 millennia?
When Aset nodded, Marcus shook his head.
That block of time has always been a bit of a fuzzy spot in my memory.
And now you know why.
Because Lex tapped into the power Nguyen gave her and made me forget.
Actually, she made you remember a slightly altered version of events, but essentially, yes, she sealed your true memories away. Aset touched the side of the box. She made this for you, so you would be able to survive while she's gone.
My eyes could have been tricking me. I mean, I hadn't blinked for at least 2 minutes, so it was entirely possible. But I thought I could see Marcus's hands tremble as he opened the box. He pulled out a tiny crystal bottle attached to a silver chain, heavy enough not to look too girly on a guy, but not thick enough to look like a ridiculous gangsta chain. He held the bottle up in front of his face.
This isn't quartz, is it?
Aset shook her head.
It is made of the art itself.
She took it from his hands and lifted it, standing on tiptoes to raise it over his head. She settled the chain around his neck, tucking the tiny bottle into his shirt.
And inside it is packed full of Lex's bonding pheromones. All you have to do is have it touching your skin and you should be fine. For a while. But you must not open the bottle or the pheromones will float away.
Marcus touched his fingertips to the little lump under his shirt.
Better?
Alex asked, studying his face. He nodded and took a full, deep breath.
Much. And what about Lex?
Her eyes most definitely twinkled.
Trust me when I say that Lex is doing just fine.
Marcus shook his head.
How? You forget, dear brother.
She touched her fingertips to his chiseled cheek.
Lex has you.
Marcus said nothing for several seconds.
You mentioned going somewhere.
Already his voice sounded less tight, less strained, and he stood a little taller.
Yes,
Aset said, readjusting her shoulder bag.
We must leave for the nature at Oasis immediately. Lex has left you something there that I think you'll be eager to see.
She left me something from the past?
Yes, and only once we've gone to the Oasis and explored what she left behind will she return. She nodded once. This I know.
Very well. Marcus strode toward the door, Dom and Aset close on his heels. During the journey, you will tell me everything you know of what is going on with Lex, he said to Aset over his shoulder. He opened the door and held it for the other two to pass through the doorway.
And I will tell you what I can,
Aset said as the door swung shut. Stunned by pretty much everything that had just happened, I stared at the door. Until Neffy clapped her hands repeatedly. What are you just standing around for? Go make yourselves useful. We're leaving soon. For once, I had no retort. I hopped off my stool and hurried to the door. Go! Neffy repeated, and I heard Jenny rushing along behind me. I stuffed my favorite pair of jeans into my duffel bag, which also happened to be the only pair of jeans I had packed from Seattle, which honestly I thought was showing a ton of restraint, then pulled them back out and tossed them onto the bed. Skinny jeans and the Sahara did not seem like an epic combination, but just as I was zipping up the bag, I stuffed them back in. Dominic barged into the room. No knock, no apology, just barging.
Why are you not ready yet?
I could have been naked, I said, crossing my arms over my minuscule chest. You really should have knocked. He stood in the doorway and stared at me.
But you weren't.
No, but I could have been. It's about respect, you know? I quirked my mouth to the side. He furrowed his brow, looking, of all things, confused. Men.
You would have knocked for Lex. Lex would already have been packed and downstairs. Dom raised his eyebrows lazily. Who even does that? I would not have had to retrieve her. I rolled my eyes. Well, in case you haven't noticed, I'm not Lex. I have, but I am not the one who keeps comparing you to the Meswet. I rolled my eyes again and hoisted my duffel bag onto my shoulder before reaching for the messenger bag containing my more personal items. So what's this oasis place like anyway? Is it filled with springs and palm trees and camels that spit and... You have watched too many movies. I approached the doorway and the new door formerly known as Dominic, stopping in front of him to show him my haha, you're so funny face. I'm 18, which means I'm still a teenager. Note the teen. That means watching movies is practically part of my job. It's like school. Dom stared down at me, those dark eyes seeming to dig into my soul and to weigh its worth. He didn't look impressed. You received your diploma. You no longer attend school. Only because Marcus's people had arranged it right before we left Seattle. Whatever. Move? He didn't. I batted my eyelashes at him and smiled sweetly. Please? Dom sighed and stepped out of my way. I paused in the hallway to wait for him as he shut the door. Such a gentleman, my big, stuffier than an antique shop brother. You never answered my question. What's this Netjar oasis like? And how come I've never heard of it if it's like a thing? Dom smoothed his hair back and started walking toward the stairs, and I fell in step beside him. We don't speak of it, he said. Why not? Because the oasis is where the Great Father's body lies. I stopped dead in my tracks in the middle of the hallway. Wait, what? We know where Nguyen's body is and it's not a sacred place? How is this oasis not our Mecca? A great disaster befell it thousands of years ago, immediately after Nguyen's death, and the desert reclaimed it, and since then it has not been spoken of except amongst the closest of friends. It is somewhat of a taboo topic. He continued on down the hall, and I had to speed walk to keep up. But why? Why all the mystery and secrecy and stuff? Why don't we ever talk about it, or what happened there? Dom shrugged. It simply is our way. It is tradition. You should respect it. I could almost hear him silently saying, You should respect me. I rolled my eyes again. Dozens of us stood in the Cairo Palace's marble and gold grand entryway, all of our attention on Marcus and Aset, who were posted before the doors. Marcus was making his final announcements and doing a half-assed job of taking roll call. We're leaving in 15 minutes, Marcus said. If you see that someone is missing, find them before we leave. We are going with or without them. Clearly, solving the problem of his withdrawal symptoms hadn't improved his mood much. I glanced around the cavernous space, scanning the backs of heads and faces of each person. I reached for Dom's sleeve and gave it a tug. When he shot me a sideways glance, I said, My mom's not here. I've got to go get her. Pressing his lips together, Dom shrugged. I dropped my bags on the polished marble stairs and turned to run back up, but a hand latched around my elbow before I'd made it 2 steps. I turned. Dom, what? Hurry, he said, his dark eyes intense. Sometimes he looked so much like Set. It was creepy. I nodded, and when he released me, I raced up the stairs that much faster. I ran down the hall past the room I was sharing with Jenny, skidded around a corner, heading for my mom's room, and lunged forward the last few steps, falling to my knees, because there, on the floor in front of her door, was Jenny, blood seeping through the crotch of her khaki pants. I didn't even hesitate. Dom! 20. Death and Threat. Dom! He rounded the corner at a near sprint and seemed to assess the situation in a matter of seconds. "Nefi," he called over his shoulder. "We need you. It's Jenny. Something has happened." I reached for Jenny's hand, squeezing it, but not too hard because it was limp and felt so fragile, and I didn't want to break her. There was so much blood. Nefi glided around the corner, Aset and Marcus close on her heels. "What is it?" she said, but she didn't wait for an answer. She shouldered Dom out of the way as she crouched on the other side of Jenny, reaching for her wrist. "Her pulse is weak." She focused on the blood seeping through Jenny's pants, staining the fabric crimson, then shifted her focus to me. "You've been spending a lot of time with her. Has she complained of any discomfort, cramping, bleeding?" I... Swallowing and unable to tear my eyes away from the blood, I nodded. "My mom, she... Nefi reached across Jenny's body and closed her hand around my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. "Your mother what?" Eyes wide, I shook my head. So much blood. It was only hours ago that Jenny had been talking about the baby, about how she was going to love it no matter what, and now, what if she was losing it? "Cat!" I blinked, but I couldn't look away. Dom knelt beside me. "Let go, Nefi." As Nefi released my wrist, Dom captured my hand. "Look at me, Cat." His voice was gentle. "Look at me." I did, and it was like I had been underwater, but had just broken through the surface and could breathe. I stared into his eyes, thinking they weren't nearly as cold and boring as I had thought. They were guarded. They held secrets. They were filled with emotion, turmoil, desperation, anger, not devoid of it like I had pretended. "You mentioned your mother, Cat. Why?" I rubbed my thumb over the back of Jenny's hand. Jenny, she started feeling nauseous, like all the time. I told her she should tell Nefi, but my mom stopped by our room before she could and started asking Jenny about her pregnancy and how she was feeling. I frowned. I remember thinking it was weird that she was being so chatty with Jenny because she hadn't said much to me since I switched rooms. "And what happened next?" Dom's voice was coaxing, his accent soothing rather than irritating, like I used to think. And my mom told her she'd felt the same when she was pregnant with me, and then she said that nothing the doctors gave her had helped, but that Marcus showed her how to make an ancient Nezharet medicine, that it was the only thing that helped her. She told Jenny that the nausea was only the beginning and that cramping would soon follow, but that if Jenny took the medicine my mom made for her, she'd avoid the worst of it. "I never showed Jen how to make anything like that," Marcus said, a razor-sharp edge to his voice. "How long has she been taking this medicine?" Aset asked. I looked at her. Since we got to Cairo?" I shrugged. "So like 4 or 5 days?" I started shaking my head. "But my mom would never..." The concoction could have been tainted with a bacteria," Aset said. "Maybe E. coli or listeria. The girl likely would have assigned any symptoms caused by the infection to her pregnancy." "You have medical training," Nefi said. It wasn't a question. "I do." Aset glanced at Marcus. "I was the doctor who treated Lex last year after..." Marcus clenched his jaw so hard that I was surprised I didn't hear the sound of his teeth breaking. "Did you know what that piece of shit would do to her?" Aset didn't even blink an eye at his seething tone. "I did." "And you didn't try to stop it?" And I was starting to worry about Aset's safety as Marcus glared at her. If looks could kill, she would have died like 8,000 times in a few seconds. Aset pursed her lips and raised her eyebrows. "Lex is the one who told me when and where I had to be so that she and I would meet when she first woke in the hospital. She told me it had to happen that way." Guys?" I stared down at Jenny's washed-out face. "Shouldn't we be doing something to help Jenny and the baby?" My words seemed to shake Marcus out of his outraged trance, and he started barking orders. "Nefi, do what you need to do for Jenny, and when you know more, let me know what kind of delay we're looking at." Nefi bowed her head. Yes, father. She looked at Aset, who nodded and moved closer to her, and the two Negerettes started speaking in hushed tones. Dom, Marcus said. Arrange a team to search for Jen. Find her. Dominic was up and running down the hall as soon as Marcus's order was voiced. Marcus turned eyes that burned like the sun on me. You don't leave my sight. I gulped. It was all I could do to make myself nod. Jen's gone, Dom said as he strode into the sitting room next to the entryway, where Marcus, Aset, and I had been waiting, surrounded by Lex's full retinue of guards. In my opinion, it was less of a sitting room and more of a ballroom with fancy things like settees and chaise lounges. Dominic stopped on the enormous, intricately patterned rug in front of the armchair where Marcus was sitting. The security cameras caught her sneaking away last night during the chaos after you. He cleared his throat. After Lex vanished. I have our people working on tracking her down. Aset said something to Marcus in a language that sounded a little bit like the Negerette language, but whatever they were speaking was different enough that I couldn't understand it. But I could understand their tones. Snippy. Just like a brother and sister should sound, I thought. So she left to do something. I shrugged nonchalantly, feeling anything but nonchalant. I don't see why you guys are so hell-bent on finding her. I mean, it might all have been an accident, and Jenny and the baby are fine. Neffy said so. She didn't actually hurt anyone. It wasn't that I was an idiot, at least not most of the time, but this was my mom they were hunting down. My mom! She wasn't the kind of person who would do something like poison a woman in an attempt to make her miscarry. She was the type of person who helped people, not hurt them. Yeah, if you looked up denial in the dictionary... Only the guilty run, Dom said. She ran. But... Marcus straightened in his chair, stretching his back. Leaning forward, he rested an elbow on his knee and rubbed his hand over his short hair. That's not always true, Dom. He exhaled a heavy sigh. Pull our people back in. We'll need all the trustworthy help we can get at the oasis. Dom bowed his head, then turned and walked toward the doorway. Wait. Marcus lifted his head to look at Dom. I want Lex's parents and grandmother here before we leave. Are you intending for them to accompany us to the oasis? Dom asked. I am. Dom's eyes narrowed the slightest amount. You understand that by doing this, you'll likely have to reveal the truth about us to Alice and Joe. Marcus nodded. It was bound to happen eventually. Lex will not be pleased. Lex isn't here, Marcus snapped, earning mutters from the guards stationed around the room and a tisk from his sister. But she will be more displeased if she returns to find them dead. That shut everyone up. They're coming with us. Work out the details with Alex. He's upstairs with Neffy in Jenny's room. Again, Dom bowed his head and walked toward the doorway. I licked my lips and switched from watching Dom to looking at Marcus. If you ever do find my mom, I hesitated. What are you going to do to her? Marcus stared at me for a long time, his face tense. Alex is demanding Negerette justice, but... He sighed. He'd been doing that a lot lately. I've loved Jen like a sister for a long time. He shook his head. I won't sanction her death until we know everything. Her guilt, her motivations, her accomplices, and only if her overall intent was malicious. Sanction her death? I swallowed, cleared my throat, licked my lips, swallowed again. There was a metallic taste in my mouth. I wondered if I might vomit. And what about me? You will swear an oath, just as Dom did centuries ago, just as all of Set's children must do, and be adopted into my line. It would have been required of you upon full manifestation anyway. And if I don't? My voice was tiny, too high. His eyes burned into me. You already know the answer to that question. He was right, and I nodded. All of Set's children were given a choice: swear an oath to obey Marcus absolutely and completely, and Nezarets took oaths very seriously, or die. It was by the council's edict, and was only by Marcus's tireless arguing on our behalf that we weren't all put to death immediately. Everyone knew it. Lex didn't have to swear the oath. Shut up, I screamed at myself, but for some idiotic reason I just kept on blabbing. She's Set's daughter too, but she's also my bondmate. Marcus's lips spread into a cruel grin. You are not. He leaned forward, resting both of his elbows on his knees. I'm not known for my patience and mercy, Cat. Be careful. Be careful of what? I hated myself for stuttering, but sometimes Marcus could be really effing scary. How does Lex do it? Of everything. A breath. 5. A dozen. Okay, I said, nodding. I'll swear the oath. Thank you for listening. That is the end of this episode of Read by the Author, but I will be back next week to continue the story. See you then.